and welcome to Rising. We've got a busy day ahead of us, so let's get right to it, reacting to the debate that was last night. Briahna, take it away.
Well, Robby, 4 of the 5 remaining GOP primary candidates got into it last night. They met on the News Nation debate stage to hash out their differences. Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, and Vivek Ramaswamy tackled a number of issues from the economy to the border to Israel and to Ukraine, and also the elephant in the room, or not in the room, former President Donald Trump. However, the night's biggest moment came when personal animosities between Ramaswamy and Haley exploded over this challenge given to the former UN ambassador.
Hi, man. So foreign policy experience is not the same as foreign policy wisdom. I want everybody at home to note that I was the first person to say we need a reasonable peace deal in Ukraine. Now a lot of the neocons are quietly coming along to that position, with the exceptions of Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, who still support this, what I believe is pointless war in Ukraine. And I think those with foreign policy experience, one thing that Joe Biden and Nikki Haley have in common is that neither of them could even state for you 3 provinces in eastern Ukraine that they want to send our troops to actually fight for. Look at that. This is what I want people to understand. These people have, I mean, she has no idea what the hell the names of those provinces are, but she wants to send our sons and daughters and our troops and our military equipment to go fight it. So reject this myth that they've been selling you, that somebody had a cup of coffee stint at the UN and then makes $8 million after, has real foreign policy experience. It takes an outsider to see this through. Look at the blank expression. She doesn't know the names of the provinces that she wants to actually fight for. And there's her puppet masters right there, the donors right there that are playing her like the puppet masters.
Hold on. Now, that wasn't Vivek's only swing at Nikki Haley over the course of the night.
We're talking about that trans issue. And Nikki Haley's campaign launch video sounded like a woke Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light ad talking about how she would kick in heels. At the first debate, she said that only a woman can get this job done. That's what she said. After the third debate, when I criticized Ronna McDaniel after 5 failed years of leadership of this party and criticized Nikki for her corrupt foreign dealings as a military contractor, she said that I have a woman problem. Nikki, I don't have a woman problem. You have a corruption problem. And I think that that's what people need to know. Nikki is corrupt. This is a woman who will send your kids to die so she can buy a bigger house. This is the problem. Using identity politics more effectively than Kamala Harris is a form of intellectual fraud.
Those weren't even Ramaswamy's most controversial moments from the night. Here's what he also said that got liberal commentators very riled up.
If you want somebody who's going to speak truth to power, then vote for somebody who's going to speak the truth to you. Why am I the only person on this stage, at least, who can say that January 6th now does look like it was an inside job? That the government lied to us for 20 years about Saudi Arabia's involvement in 9/11? That the Great Replacement theory is not some grand right-wing conspiracy theory, but a basic statement of the Democratic Party's platform? That the 2020 election was indeed stolen by big tech. That the 2016 election, the one that Trump won for sure, was also one that was stolen from him by the national security establishment that actually put up the Trump-Russia collusion hoax that they knew was false.
Joining us to discuss is political reporter at Semafor, Dave Weigel, and Washington editor at The Spectator and Rising Fridays co-host, Amber Duke. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I want to come to you first, Amber, for identity politics reasons, to get your view on whether you think Ramaswamy is right as he characterizes Nikki Haley as indulging or overindulging in a kind of gendered identity politics, talking about her heels and whether a woman has to be the one to do the job in Washington.
Yeah, I actually think he's right. And I've been saying this since Nikki Haley launched her campaign. That heels comment was so unbelievably cringy, and she's doubled down on it right after the last debate when Vivek Ramaswamy went after her and Ron DeSantis, saying that they were essentially Dick Cheney in heels. She popped off to Twitter and was talking about how those heels are her ammunition. She corrected him on stage and said, actually, they're not 3-inch, they're 5-inch heels, as if that somehow, negates the attack. I think it's bizarre in 2023 for any Republican candidate to be talking about woman as if it's a qualification.
So, Dave, I want to come to you. Clearly, Nikki Haley has had some movement in her direction lately to be kind of the candidate, as people in the Republican coalition who are looking for someone other than Trump. There's not enough of them. Trump is still, wildly ahead if you check polls. But there's been a settling on Nikki Haley lately. The Koch network decided to back her, even though her foreign policy commitments are very opposite their own kind of non-interventionist efforts. But it seems like she's kind of her moment has arrived, and so she's taking on a lot of heat from Vivek. Obviously, she's been taking on heat from him even before she was kind of up there. Based on the reporting you do and talking to folks, how is this shaping up with Haley, and then also with DeSantis, who's I think has conceded recently that he thinks he has no chance of being the nominee unless something rather dramatic happens to Trump, which could frankly happen given the legal situation.
Right, and at Semafor, we've been reporting on some people who've left the Koch network over this Haley endorsement, which is still happening. I think there are people within the network who assumed that this endorsement process they talked about in February wasn't actually going to lead to fruition. They don't support Haley's foreign policy. They don't like the idea of who she'd bring into the administration. But yes, you framed it correctly. She came to this debate after a month of donors going her way. I thought it was curious and maybe a long-term mistake in how much she boasted about it. She said at one point in an exchange with DeSantis that he was just angry because those Wall Street donors that used to support him now support her. I haven't heard many candidates successfully brag about how many Wall Street donors they have. And Vivek is in a weakened position in this primary. Beyond just what people think of on stage, his negative has been going up with Republican voters in Iowa and New Hampshire. But he, I think, performed a good service for Trump there in drawing her out repeatedly on all those questions, all the things that make a lot of sense if you're in a room in the Hamptons or in New York talking to Jamie Dimon types who just kind of want things to reset the clock to 2009. He tried to draw her out, I don't think successfully all the time, but tried to point out this is not as much as it polls well or pleases those guys, not a populist position that's in sync with the new Republican coalition. I think it was a little bit much to do in one debate, but that was the theme whenever I heard Ramaswamy attacking in a substantive way.
Dave, I take your point on that, but this seems to be one of the issues with the kind of Republican version of populism to begin with. While there is populist rhetoric, there's very little in terms of commitments of saying, I'm not going to take corporate money, I'm going to disavow corporate PAC money. I think that Citizens United and laws that enable endless corporate money to get involved in politics are bad. You don't hear those kinds of critiques. So I do wonder if someone in a field where the populism is so much based in rhetoric as opposed to actually foregoing those kind of corporate dollars, if pointing out that, hey, I'm the one that's the more successful one here, you also did take that money and now you're just mad that you're not getting it anymore. You've made absolutely no commitments before they left you to actually disavow that money, is a more compelling pitch than it would be in perhaps a left Democratic context.
I think it's more compelling, and there's some substance there. I mean, it's a fact. Ron DeSantis cost corporations money, cost Florida some money with stances he took against corporate diversity ESG policies. That's just true. I think his problem in this primary has been it's just not a top of mind issue for a lot of Republican voters, not one that separates him from Donald Trump. They're not worried that if Donald Trump is president, he's going to go easy on them too, even though he did as president. He gets away with a lot of things. Yes, she is. I think this was, as much as Haley's still in a strong position, she was critiqued and all the vulnerabilities she has in that space here, which is she is generally more supportive of laissez-faire capitalism, bringing business to the state with tax incentives, boasting about bringing Boeing to the state. She's very anti-union, which hasn't really come up since the UAW strike, but is a factor here. They tried to draw it out. It is, I think, a significant difference between Haley and the rest of the field that's left. You had Tim Scott for a while. You now really have her as the one representative of this sort of Bush-era republicanism that says we need more privatization, more. But whatever Wall Street, I don't want to be too pejorative, but whatever Wall Street wants is good for the country. You had DeSantis is the one who quoted Silent Cal Coolidge there and said he was right. So, but he has, and Ramaswamy have a different view of the power of government to shape bad behavior in capitalism than Haley does. She just simply doesn't. It was just a little bit frustrating that the debate dovetailed into so many other places, because that was really an important difference between how she would govern and how Trump and the rest would.
Amber, I thought it was interesting that this debate, moderated by Megyn Kelly, was one of the people up on the stage, has a lot of interest, on her show. She talks a lot about gender issues, the transgender debate that came up in this in the debate last night. I think some of the issues that do in fact pertain to that Republican primary voters care about and are interested in hearing more about. The candidates got grilled on that. Given this is still the Republican primary, I thought it was good to have some of those conversations. What did you make of the responses along those lines?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that you're right. I think the questions were more diverse and more of interest to a Republican primary voter than any debate thus far. I mean, it's pretty absurd to put a bunch of Republican candidates on a stage and ask the question. I think it was a couple of debates ago under the premise that trans kids will kill themselves if they don't get gender affirming care or whatever. Like, just the premise is flawed for a Republican primary debate. So I thought the questions were a lot better, first of all. But the responses were interesting because you had Nikki Haley and DeSantis going after one another, where Nikki Haley had punted on a bathroom bill around the same time that North Carolina did, I believe in 2017. And DeSantis grilled her on that, and she did not seem to have a good response to it. Chris Christie actually jumped into the fray and tried to sort of thread this needle that I've seen some people on the left doing, actually, which is the idea that parental rights, in terms of what DeSantis wants to do with the education system, making sure parents have knowledge about what their kids are learning in school and maybe some input into the idea of parental rights in regards to whether or not children should be able to undergo these sex change or gender affirming treatments, as the left calls them. I've never heard that made by a conservative or a Republican thus far, and he got hammered for it, right? Because DeSantis's immediate, obvious response was there's no parental right to child abuse, and it was just the nail in the coffin. I think that the issue, insofar as it matters on the debate stage, is that I think it's a disqualifying if you have the wrong answer in a primary.
Some people would argue that, say, homeschooling your children or denying them a meningitis vaccine or a polio vaccine or the slate of childhood vaccines that have become that have saved so many lives over the course of history is a kind of child abuse. Should the government intervene?
Is child abuse?
I'm sorry?
You said homeschooling is a form of child abuse, or people would argue that?
Well, you're very incredulous there, Amber, but many people think
that's insane. Exactly, it is insane because outcomes for homeschool kids are actually,
Amber, would you mind
in many cases, better than for public school kids. Why would that be considered a form of abuse?
Well, Amber, many people say that allowing your kid to transition.
Many people say, okay.
I would appreciate it if you could respectfully have this conversation with me, Amber. And I don't think the snark is necessarily going to advance the conversation here. So as I was saying, it is obviously the case that many people in America, as evidenced by polls and the fact that this is a contentious issue, feel very differently about issues about relating to whether their children should be allowed to transition. Is that an internal parental decision or not? Just like you think, obviously, it is not child abuse to withhold life-saving vaccines from your children or to keep them out of the school system or to perhaps not keep them up with the generally publicly recommended educational standards of the school. Other people feel the same way about their child's sexual orientation and ability to transition. So this is the question. Americans are obviously divided about these issues. The fundamental question is, should the government pick sides and be interfering in what parents decide for their own children?
Yeah, sorry, I apologize for the snark. I was genuinely incredulous that homeschooling would in any way be compared to gender reassignment surgery for young people.
What about
I think the obvious difference here. Sorry?
What about measles, the rubella childhood vaccinations, for example? And we're seeing vaccination levels, historically low now, I think because of the politics around the COVID crisis. Should the government intervene and step in and force parents to vaccinate their kids and not just say, if you enroll them in public school, you have to vaccinate them, but point blank period, this is the law that you have to vaccinate your kids. These are the kind of debates that people are having.
Whether if they're going to go to a public school.
Right, that's what I just said.
Right, I don't think,
the
debate frankly isn't really over whether the government can compel them abstractly.
Right, but right now we're in a period of time where some people would say that even if my kid does not go to school, I shouldn't be allowed to let my kid transition in my own home, that the government should come in and get between me and my doctor and my decision to let my kid transition outside of a public school context. How is that not analogous?
Yeah.
The analogy that DeSantis is making on the stage is the idea that you shouldn't give your kid what the left calls medical treatment, which doesn't actually treat them because it doesn't reduce the rate of suicidal ideation or anxiety or depression, and instead has all kinds of lifelong consequences, such as potentially sterilizing a kid. He's likening that to actual child abuse, as in like beating your kid. He's not saying it's compared to, there's not, like, to me, there's not a debate over it because the science doesn't back up the idea that what the left calls gender affirming treatment is doing anything to actually help these kids.
Well, people say
in
the
fact,
same
it only
things,
comes along with harm.
All right,
I just want to say this. People say the same thing about science with the vaccines, and that science is very clear about the childhood vaccines preventing you from dying of polio and the like, and that's why the government should intervene on the parents' behalf.
I'm not arguing against childhood vaccines. I mean, at least it would have to be on a case-by-case basis. Like, I don't think children should have to get the COVID vaccine because, again, the science doesn't back up that those actually are beneficial to kids.
Yeah. Dave, I want to give you the last word here. Let's return to the kind of situation in the Republican primary. Does it make sense for them to stick it out? Trump is so far ahead, I think no one reasonably expects that any of these candidates, Haley, DeSantis, Ramaswamy, would beat him when it comes to actually voting. But his legal situation could be tenuous. Does it actually make sense strategically for them to stick it out in case, for whatever reason, he ends up not being on the ballot because of the legal issues?
Yeah, that scenario you just sketched out is hard to game out because imagine the response of a Republican voter who agrees with someone like Tucker Carlson and says that what is being done to Trump is violating his rights, is the government using its powers to prosecute political enemies. Imagine then looking at a Republican Party that says, well, they're right. He's in jail, so we're going to have to pick another nominee. It's very tough to see the party surviving a situation like that. It's as tough as if Hillary Clinton had been indicted in 2016 and the Democratic Party tried to dump its first female presidential nominee, even though they might have won the election. No, the strategy for everyone who's not Trump is to last as long as possible. For Haley in particular, it is do well in Iowa, win New Hampshire, get a showdown with him. But none of them are in a position to beat him right now after New Hampshire. If you look at the states, not just South Carolina, this gap you have between that primary and the first southern primary, but the Super Tuesday map. These are states where Trump is dominant, where he's 50 points ahead of everybody else, and where Republican voters have made this determination that they agree with his policies, they like him personally, they think that anything levied against him by the state, by federal prosecutors, by prosecutors in New York, all of that is a bogus attempt to get him off the ballot. That's something that you saw. Only Christie disagrees and says this is a real problem people should take seriously. And you see how much purchase he has in the primary. He gets booed on stage. His negatives in every state, including New Hampshire, are in the 60s Republican. So it is I think, going back to those rooms of donors in the Hamptons that like Nikki Haley and used to like Tim Scott and Ron DeSantis, it makes sense to them. It does not make sense to many Republican voters that they might dump Donald Trump for what they view as politically motivated BS.
Make it make sense, they say. All right, Dave Weigel, Amber, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.